God works through both nations and individuals. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And as always, before I get into the topic today, I want to give a quick heads up that if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. That is the online platform for all your faith-based podcasts, and I'm happy to say that Bold and Blunt is among its esteemed offerings. So go there, check it out, download it, listen to Bold and Blunt, and also pick up some of the other faith-based podcasts at Edify. You can also get Bold and Blunt at WashingtonTimes.com, where you can sign up for my 3 times a week newsletter. It comes out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, delivered right to your email box in time for the lunch hour. Contains all my Washington Times commentaries for the week, as well as my twice weekly Tuesday and Thursday Bold and Blunt podcast, which, one more heads up, you can also get Bold and Blunt anywhere podcasts are offered. And if you already subscribe, thank you. Thank you so much for listening and supporting Bold and Blunt. Let's start with the faith of the Founding Fathers, how God works through a nation. Now, I know there are many disputes out there, particularly coming from the atheist crowd, saying that America was not founded on anything having to do with God, that America perhaps may have had a few founding fathers who believed in God, but they definitely specified that God and government should never mix, never the two should mix. And yet, the historical truth shows that America was founded first and foremost on a quest for religious freedom. So how can you, just common sense speaking, without even understanding all the various details of America's founding, how can you say that a nation that was founded on a quest for religious freedom wanted to remove God from the public stage? That can't be true. So I think that there are very many disagreements out there that are started by the leftists in America, because the idea from the left is that God gets in the way of government power. And so the left ultimately wants to remove God from the public stage in order to open the doors for a bigger, biggest government footprint. This is why your communist societies ultimately have to get rid of the churches, have to boot God from the public square, because ultimately those in communist societies want the people looking for the government to provide for all. They want ultimately, in the end, the worship of the people. Well, in America, a country founded on the exceptional ideal that individual rights come from God and that government is only there to protect and preserve those already inherent rights. In a country like this, you can't remove God completely from the public square. Else, there only exists government. Government becomes the provider of all. At the same time, America wasn't founded explicitly as a Christian nation. So we need to get that clear. Yes, the God that founding fathers turned to for biblical truths, the God that some founding fathers went to church to worship at the time, and the biblical principles that the founding fathers wove into the government they created based on individual liberties, that was the God of the Christian religion, right? It wasn't the God of the Muslim religion or Hindu God or the tree goddess that the left likes to say is alive and well today. It wasn't any of that. It was the Judeo-Christian belief, the Judeo-Christian biblical truths that influenced so many of the founders. So there's this really good essay written at the Masters University, penned by Dr. Greg Frazier. He is a professor of history and political studies at the Masters University, and he wrote this in October of 2016. I just want to read part of it. Did America's founders intend to create a Christian nation? Does it matter today? And if so, why? In order to arrive at a proper answer to the first question, he writes, one must recognize that the Founding Fathers were a diverse group of individuals who held diverse views on most subjects, including religion. Generally, one cannot accurately make blanket statements beginning with, "The Founding Fathers believed." Second, not everyone who lived during the founding era was a founding father, so not all voices are equal as evidence. Good points both, right? Third, he writes, the Puritans did not found America, they founded Massachusetts. There is no reason to elevate their views or experience above those of other colonies. The founders themselves did not give Massachusetts or its representatives preeminence philosophically or politically. And fourth, he writes, some of the more prominent founders meant something different by the word Christianity than do 21st century evangelical Christians. I think that is his most important and interesting point. Consequently, he writes, it is not appropriate or intellectually honest to quote their uses of the word to audiences today without explaining that they meant a system of moral teachings and not orthodox biblical Christianity. And fifth, like today, denominational labels were not very accurate determinants of personal belief in 18th century America. So that's the opener. Let me read one more paragraph from here because this gets into the argument that Founding Fathers weren't Christian so much as deists. He writes, finally, Christianity and deism were not the only two religious options available to 18th century Americans. It is inaccurate and misleading to lump all of the founders into one of those two camps. That creates a false dichotomy. If one demonstrates that someone was not a deist, that does not necessarily mean that he was a Christian, and vice versa. Good point. In reality, a number of the key American founders were neither Christians nor deists, but theistic rationalists. He goes on to explain theistic rationalists believed in a powerful, rational, and benevolent creator God who is present and active in human affairs. They believed that the main factor in serving God was living a good and moral life, that promoting morality was the central value and purpose of religion, and that religion was indispensable to society because it engendered morality. Let me read that last. They believed religion was indispensable to society because it engendered morality. Let me just finish up, just to put it in more context. He also went on to write, they believed that virtually all religions fulfilled that purpose, not just Christianity. That is why they allowed freedom of religion. Okay, end quote for all this. I don't agree with everything that he writes in this entire essay, okay? But I do find that the viewpoint that the Founding Fathers believed that religion was indispensable to society because it engendered morality. I believe that is a central theme that goes missing from America's discussions today on religion in society, on the need for religion and belief in God to keep American society free, to keep individual freedoms intact. Another way of saying this is people who are moral and virtuous don't need human laws to make them moral and virtuous. People who understand that God does not condone murder don't, in addition, need law enforcement or judges or legislators in America telling them not to murder, because they already understand that concept as it comes from God. They already understand the commandments from God don't allow that. And so that's what keeps our nation free. That's how God works through our nation. Our nation was founded on an American exceptionalism principle that individual rights come from a creator, which founding fathers recognized. Regardless of their individual personal religious beliefs, founding fathers recognized that our rights are rooted in gifts from the creator. We are born with certain rights, and that government's only there to protect and preserve those rights. So in America, that's how God works through our entire nation. It's in our DNA. God-given rights, it's not just a gift or a blessing. It also carries a responsibility. So while God may be working through America, the Spirit of God may be woven throughout the entire land of America. The Spirit of God carrying the spirit of individual liberty, being woven throughout the entire country of America. It's also incumbent on each and every individual in America who recognizes his or her rights coming from the Creator, coming from God, to stand tall for godly principles. Because if we who know better what America stands for, God-given rights, if we fail to keep God elevated in his position of authority in America, we have failed. We have failed our nation. We have failed our Creator. We have failed our founding fathers. And coming round the corner on Memorial Day, as we just did, we have failed those who have died in the service of protecting our great God-given liberties. So yes, God works through an entire nation. God is sovereign over all the nations. But he's also sovereign with individuals. He also works through individuals. He certainly worked through the founding fathers. You can't deny that. And you can't deny many of the founding fathers' own accounts of how the merciful hand of God guided their discussions during the sometimes acrimonious debates over the founding of our country. How God certainly saved the great American patriots who fought the greatest armies in the world, the greatest navy in the world at the time to win this country. God certainly worked through individuals back then. But God's alive and well, right? He's alive and well in this nation today. And he's doing some miraculous things. He's doing some miraculous things on behalf of those fighting for the freedoms of America, empowering those who would seem to have the quietest, littlest voices, but empowering them to go against the big Goliaths in government. Just look at the parents who rose up in Virginia against school boards who had exerted their big government socialist stamps on the youngest minds for years and years, only to be outed during the coronavirus when all of a sudden parents were tipped off to the horrible things their kids were being taught in the public school systems. And look how parents fought back, the littlest voices going against the Goliaths in government and winning an entire election. Winning the governor's mansion, winning lieutenant governor, attorney general. So God is definitely working through some of the more quieter voices in America, the ones who maybe have lain dormant for far too long, honestly. But maybe they were quiet because they didn't realize the power that they had. Maybe they got used to the government telling them that they had to do this and that and that and this, and that they had no power, they had no control. And it was only until the outrage had gotten so great that they decided to exercise their God-given liberties, their God-given parental rights, and fight back. And I think that's part of the problem. People in America have forgotten the power of God, how God can work through an individual. Not just a nation, but also an individual. Any individual. Yes, even you, an individual listening right now. I have a guest today who actually has written a book demonstrating how God has worked through some of those in society that you wouldn't even consider God would go near, depending on your faith, depending on your belief system, depending on which church you attend and what your pastor tells you. But guess what? God works in mysterious ways. And no matter who you are in life, no matter your past, no matter your background, no matter what you do right now in life or what you've done in your past, God works through you if you open your heart and mind to Him working through you. My guest today is Greg Laurie. He is the senior pastor of Harvest Christian Fellowship in California and Hawaii, and he has written several best-selling books, the latest of which showcases rock stars and their relationship with Jesus. Yes, rock stars. Pastor Laurie, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Your new book.
For having me.
You're very welcome. Your new book, Lennon, Dylan, Alice, and Jesus, the spiritual biography of rock and roll, already a new release on several categories in Amazon. John Lennon, Bob Dylan, Alice Cooper, and Jesus. It sounds like one of those childhood games. One of these things is not like the other, and yet you link them.
Well, yes, I do. And really, it is interesting because they don't seem to go together, but in many ways they do. It could just as easily be your name or my name. You know, rock icons, they're just like us. They're regular people. They have been given extraordinary talent. They sort of breathe rarefied air. But when the day is done and the doors are shut, they're just the same people that we are, except many of them have had this incredible success. It's like they climbed to the top of the pinnacle of fame and found out there's really nothing there. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that these people often turn to bad things, like drugs or drinking or other excesses, because they're searching. You know, these are kind of sensitive souls. They're people that have a certain talents that most people don't have, and so they reach the dreams that they had, maybe surpass their dreams, and then they find out there's nothing there. So this book I read about some who made the wrong decisions, and their life is a cautionary tale of what not to do, like a chapter I have called The 27 Club, which is a story of rock stars that died at the age of 27, including Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and then later Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse. And then there is also the stories of those that actually came to faith, surprisingly, after they probably sampled a lot of things that this world has to offer. So I hope it will be a hopeful book for people to read, a book that will say to them that no one is beyond the reach of God, that no matter how many bad choices you've made and how many wrong things you've done, you can have a second chance through a relationship with God.
I like your premise. I'm just curious, in your title, the three rock stars you name in your title, were any of those examples of contrite who came to Jesus before their time was up? Actually, Bob Dylan is, I'm not sure if he's alive or dead. Alice Cooper, still alive, yes? And of course, John Lennon dead.
Yeah, no, Bob Dylan is alive and well and touring.
Okay.
And Alice
My
Cooper
bad.
is doing the same. And John Lennon obviously met an untimely death because he was murdered outside of his home in New York City. But every one of those people on the cover had an encounter with God, including John Lennon. Now, John Lennon, we remember he made the famous statement, the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. And there was a lot of outrage and record burnings and sort of things happening in the South here in the United States. But in reality, what Lennon said was not completely untrue. For a generation of young people, and I would include myself at that moment in time, the Beatles were more popular than Jesus because we didn't know much about Jesus. But then later in his life, something a lot of people don't know, John Lennon saw Billy Graham on television and made a profession of faith. Now, it was short-lived. It lasted for 2 weeks. But during this time that he was believing, he wrote 2 gospel-centered songs, and he wrote extensively about it in his diary that he kept. But then he veered away from it, and then toward the end of his life, you see sort of a softening there, and there's some interesting stories about John that I've never seen anywhere before. And so here's my premise with John Lennon. John Lennon was tragically shot. He was alive when the officer found him, and they put him in the back of the police car, and they drove him to the hospital. And the officer asked John Lennon, "Do you know who you are?" He said, "Yes, I'm John Lennon." And so my premise is simply this. John Lennon made a profession of faith earlier in his life. If it was real or not, who can say? But if he called upon the Lord in the last moments of his life on this earth, before he entered the afterlife, God would have surely heard his prayer. And so I begin the book with this statement. There'll be 3 surprises when we get to heaven. Number 1, some of the people we thought would be there won't be there. Number 2, some of the people we never thought would be there will be there. Surprise number 3, we'll be there. So, the point of it is could we see John Lennon in heaven? Sure, it's possible. Now, Alice Cooper, he had a serious drug problem, and his life was going downhill fast, and he could have easily been another rock star statistic of a drug overdose. But one night when he had the curtains drawn and a rock of cocaine the size of a softball, and he was snorting, he looked in the mirror and saw blood coming out of his eyes. And Alice told me, I don't know if that was a hallucination or if it was really happening, but all I knew was I was going to die if I stayed on this path. And he called out to God, and the Lord intervened, heard his prayer, and Alice turned from drugs. He's been drug-free, alcohol-free for over 30 years now, and recommitted his life to Jesus Christ. By the way, Alice Cooper is the son of a preacher, so he knew a lot about the Christian faith. So that there's a story, a brief overview of 2 of those people on the cover of the book.
Wow. Credit to you for tackling this type of issue, because there are too many pastors nowadays, depending on which denomination you are or which church you attend, who don't even want to recognize the fact that anyone associated with rock music can be godly.
I would just say godly people can have their influence in any form of the arts. I mean, we look at the great paintings of the artists of the Renaissance, and they took their talent and used it for God's glory. We think of composers like Handel or Bach and others who composed great masterpieces for God's glory. Why should it surprise us that a rock star could write a song for God's glory, or a hip-hop star could do a song for the Lord? And so, godly people can make their mark anywhere, as followers of Jesus Christ, and so they should. Not everybody's called to be a preacher, but everyone's called to follow Jesus, and so I think it's a great way to have an influence on a lot of people, too.
What was your opinion when Prince died? Because he's not rock, he's pop, but I'm sure you're aware of Prince. He was a Jehovah's Witness.
Sure.
And, some in his own neighborhood said that even though he was famous, he would still go out and try and convert people to become a Jehovah's Witness. What was your view of him?
Well, I think he was extraordinarily talented, for sure. In fact, I think there's actually a video from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when George Harrison was inducted, and so they recreated the song While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Tom Petty was there, Jeff Lynne was there, George's son Danny was there, and Prince did a guitar solo that is regarded by many as the greatest guitar solo of all time. And I think I would have to concur. It was absolutely amazing. So an extraordinarily talented person, but one who ironically died of a drug overdose. And he was not a young man when he died. So it's just, to me, amazing that even people in their later years are still falling prey to the same traps. I mean, most recently, Taylor Hawkins, the drummer for Foo Fighters, I think he was 50 years old, died of a drug overdose. So it just shows that these guys, when you reach that pinnacle of fame, that's not going to satisfy that hole in your heart. And really, I think they need a relationship with God. So I talk a little bit about Prince in the book, but I also have a few pages dedicated to Sheila E., who was the percussionist in Prince's band.
Yes.
Who did make a commitment to follow Christ.
Did she really? I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
Very fascinating.
Absolutely.
So how did you gain access to, you said that you spoke with Alice Cooper personally. Did you speak with all the other rock stars you mentioned? And if so, how did you gain such access to them? That's great.
Basically, some of them I just did research on. I have a great co-author, Marshall Terrell, who did a deep dive into research. So I have not personally met Sheila E. I never met Prince. But I do know Alice Cooper. We're friends, and so I've been with him a number of times and interviewed him and spent time with him. And then other people that I mentioned in the book, some I've met, some I've read about, some I have accounts about from people that know them well or knew them well. So it's sort of a combination of a lot of things, as I compiled the research for the book.
It seems to me that your book could spark some very interesting spiritual-based discussions, not the least of which maybe the biblical principle that you're not supposed to judge, but you can judge people by their fruits.
Yes.
And so when you
That's true.
when you look at some of the fruits of these people, though, it certainly couldn't be considered biblical in many respects.
Well, who are you referring to?
Well, the drug use of many in the rock field.
Oh, sure. No, if they're, I think that if a person's really come to Jesus Christ, they're going to change, but it doesn't always happen immediately. I wrote another biography on Johnny Cash, and it's called Johnny Cash, The Redemption of an American Icon. And Johnny was raised in the church, but developed a dependence on amphetamines early in his life when he was on the road constantly. And he struggled with this for most of his life. But his faith was strong in the beginning, and it was strong at the end. So just because someone struggles with substance abuse or other things doesn't mean they're not a Christian. It may mean they're a struggling Christian. And I describe some people as a work in progress. Among them would be Bob Dylan. So Bob Dylan is obviously born and raised Jewish, and he made a very, very loud profession of faith in the 80s and recorded 3 overt Christian albums. And then he just sort of stopped talking about it. And some concluded that Dylan abandoned his faith in Jesus and returned to his Judaism. But as I've researched his life, I don't really see anything to confirm that. I think Dylan still believes, from what I can see, even in looking at his latest records and what the lyrics are about. So some people are still a work in progress, but really when you get down to it, aren't we all a work in progress? I mean, don't we all stumble and fall? Don't we all fall short? So I write with compassion about these people. I think sometimes people are very quick to condemn. One thing I've seen in comments on my social media, in particular about Bob Dylan, a couple of people said, well, I think he sold his soul to the devil. And my response is, you can't sell your soul to the devil. It's not yours to sell.
Right.
The devil doesn't come to you and offer you X amount of dollars or whatever, and you say, okay, devil, you're on, let's go. Your soul belongs to God. And he's redeemed your soul by having Christ die on the cross for you. So this idea that, this person sold their soul to the devil and there's no hope, this is ridiculous. No one is beyond the reach of God, and no one is unsavable. Anybody can come to Jesus at any stage in their life. I mentioned John Lennon toward the end of his life, after he'd been shot. If he had called on the Lord would have heard his prayer and welcomed him into heaven. And the example for that in the Bible is the story of a thief on the cross, we call him. He was probably much worse than a thief because the Romans didn't crucify thieves. it was probably a murderer or an insurrectionist. And so the point is, this hardened criminal crucified next to Jesus turned to the Lord and said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So even if a person calls on the Lord on their deathbed, God would hear their prayer. Because heaven is not for good people. Heaven is for forgiven people.
Absolutely, by the grace of the cross. And just really quickly, what you explained about Bob Dylan, how he, when he was at first a believer, and then he cut 3 albums that were just blatantly Christian, and then he sort of went silent. To me, that sounds like new believers anyhow. When they first come to Christ, they're very enthusiastic about sharing all they can about their faith, and then as they mature, they get naturally more quiet, but in that quiet is their strength in faith as well.
Yeah, well, actually, after that, those first 3 records, Dylan did have gospel ideas and biblical truths still woven in his music, and in his most recent record, you see more of it. So I think Dylan, he got so much pushback when he came out strong in his faith for Christ. I went to one of his concerts during that period in Los Angeles, and he was actually sharing little things in between songs, talking about the Lord, talking about what the Bible says, and people were jeering him from the seats and yelling at him, play your old songs. We don't want to hear this new stuff, and so forth. So I don't know what happened with Bob, or even what's happening with Bob, but I don't think people should write him off. I think they should keep praying for him. And we might be surprised about what happens in his life in the future.
Absolutely. Shouldn't write anybody off. And
That's
just
right.
one last question. This is just personal curiosity. What do you know of the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger and the other band members?
Yeah, I don't really have anything in the book on them. I know very little. I mean, I obviously know who they are, and
yes.
I've known their music over the years. I do have a bit on Brian Jones, who was a founding member of the Rolling Stones, along with Mick and Keith, and he was actually thrown out of the band because of his drug use, and then ultimately drowned in a swimming pool of a drug overdose. And so it's a really tragic, cautionary tale. But I don't really get into the rest of the Stones in this book.
Well, your book sounds fascinating. Lennon, Dylan, Alice, and Jesus, the spiritual biography of rock and roll. Pastor Greg Laurie, I want to thank you for being on Bold and Blunt and discussing it. And thank you for writing this book. I can't wait to read it.
Oh, great. Thanks very much.
Once again, God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? And don't let anybody steal your godly thunder, right? Don't let anything in your past or in your present get in the way of having a relationship with Jesus. Because guess what? It's not just about you. It's about the impact you can have on those around you, on an entire nation even, if God deems it to be so. I want to thank you for listening. I want to remind you that you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. That is the online platform for faith-based podcasts, or also at thewashingtontimes.com. And one other quick note. Check out my latest book, Lockdown, The Socialist Plan to Take Away Your Freedom. The left does not want you to read this, but it's an important read. How to Save America from the Growing Socialists in the Globalist Movement. The ones that have been locking us down for 2+ years, and the ones who are trying to steal our freedoms even today based on health emergencies, the coronavirus, the monkeypox, and so forth and so on. Thank you for listening. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.